So today, Mike Duffy's first day in cross-examination, we got to see another Prince Edward Island senator. We got to see the imperious Mike Duffy, clearly wanting to be the smartest man in the room, I think. Clearly finding the prosecutor, Mike Holmes, to be a bit thick and a bit slow. Several times during the course of his cross, which has really just begun, Mr. Duffy would shake his head in sort of faux bewilderment at Mr. Holmes's stupidity or slowness or lack of familiarity with how things really work. It was quite astonishing, actually. He buried in among some fairly dull evidence were some gems. He said, for instance, he says this all the time, Duffy does. He says, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not legally trained, I'm not a lawyer. Honestly, he must have said it 6 times today alone. And yet, he acted like a lawyer. He, at one point, told the prosecutor, I'm not going any further down this road. Well, honey, the witness doesn't get to dictate what happens in court. The witness is there to answer questions. Another time in horror, because Mr. Duffy had forgotten that he met then Prime Minister Stephen Harper 3 times to discuss his coming appointment. He'd only told the court about 2 times, and Mr. Holmes was able to show him in the diaries, Mr. Duffy's diaries, that in fact there had been 3 meetings. And he suggested to the senator that perhaps he had met the Prime Minister on an earlier occasion in 2007, and perhaps he could bring his diary in. And Duffy was just outraged. She said, are you telling me you want me to bring in my private diaries so you can go through it and look at all my private things? And then looked up at the court, at the judge, and said, if this be the wish of the court? And the judge said, well, actually, it's a fair question, so yes, bring it. He was astonished, I think. So Mr. Duffy, who is not a lawyer, as he tells us at every opportunity, acts like a lawyer. So there's that. I guess the juicy part of his evidence was that he said he's never courted a Senate appointment in his life. Now, this is well-established legend in this city that Mike Duffy desperately wanted to be in the Senate for reasons that escape any normal person. But he flatly denied it. He said it's just a legend. It was a joke with him and Don Newman from CBC that they would call each other senator, and that was it. You can't control the press. They'll say what you want, what they want, etc. And I guess there were a couple of salacious bits about the former Prime Minister. He described one encounter where he said the Prime Minister had kept a whole bunch of old people waiting for a long time while he sat in his undershirt eating a hot dog. This was on Prince Edward Island, and he said, then he did Mr. Harper's voice, and there was a female staffer doing what the little woman should be, ironing his shirt. Now, aside from that being quite a ghastly vision, the only thing possibly worse could be Mr. Duffy in an undershirt. I guess the other essence of it, he didn't seek the appointment, he didn't want the appointment, he took a pay cut to get the appointment, but so far as I know, there's no senatorial conscription in this country. You don't have to take the appointment. And neither, and this is where the prosecutor made his best points, I think, neither do you have to take the living expenses. The living expenses are meant for senators who come from out of town, more than 100 kilometers away from Ottawa, and actually incur genuine expenses for being in the capital and doing their business. Mike Duffy, of course, who had, as he acknowledged today, had lived off Prince Edward Island since the early mid-60s, when he first, as a teenager, went away to get work, and had not been a resident of Prince Edward Island, and who was nonetheless, because of the stupid Senate system, appointed as the senator for PEI. Mike Duffy, and he blames this all on the Senate Conservative leader David Tkachuk, whose name I just mangled again, forgive me. He blames it all on him because he says he made me file those expenses. But those expenses are pretty key. They form a lot of the charges against Mr. Duffy. And every time he signed one of those forms, he was swearing to the fact that he'd incurred additional living expenses for living in his own house, eating the same food. And Mark Holmes took him through what his day was like when he was working for CTV in December of 2008, and what his day was like when he was a senator in February of 2009, and guess what? The days were exactly the same. Where were the additional living expenses, Mr. Holmes asked, and to this, Mr. Duffy, not being a lawyer, had no answer.